Time to get started. Welcome to the 13th event in the Herd Insights webinar series. I'm Avi Mukherjee, Dean of the AACSB accredited Lewis College of Business and Brad D. Smith Schools of Business at Marshall University. I'm excited to be with you today. Thank you for taking the time to attend this event. The Herd Insights webinar series was started last summer by the Lewis College of Business to support our community, our alumni, and other stakeholders in re-engaging, recharging, and redesigning their professional lives and business models as we emerge from the COVID-19 crisis. The mission of the Lewis College of Business and its Brad D. Smith Schools of Business is to promote economic development in the regional community and beyond. We do this by implementing our strategic priorities for external engagement and economic development through lifelong learning programs. Today, we have a special event in store. February, as you know, is Black History Month. So we are delighted to offer today's webinar titled The Economic Status of African Americans in the 21st Century. It features Dr. George Wright, President Emeritus of Texas A&M Prairie View University, noted African American scholar, and one of the foremost thinkers in the realm of social justice and diversity, equity, and inclusion. In conversation with Dr. Nabanita Biswas, Assistant Professor of Economics at the Brad D. Smith Schools of Business. Guided by President Gilbert's vision, Marshall University has been proactive in promoting social justice, supporting people of color, and fostering an open and welcoming environment. I will now invite Dr. Maurice Cooley, Vice President of Intercultural Affairs and Student Affairs at Marshall University, to say a few words on Marshall University's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Dr. Cooley.
Good morning. I am delighted to be here. I have been looking forward to this. I did not know that I was going to have a speaking part. However, as so, I offer regret on behalf of Dr. Gilbert, who was suddenly unable to join us as he had looked forward to, because he and I had talked about that last week. And I was going to step in to say hello, and I think Jerome Gilbert was going to have a larger speaking part, but due to his absence of an unanticipated life event, he's not able to be here. In fact, he could be listening, I'm not sure. However, Dr. Gilbert and I and the Office of the Provost want to commend Dr. Avi Mukherjee as one of our great deans here at this university. We want to compliment him particularly for his progressive and philosophical views on the importance of building an inclusive community at the university and in our public community. Also for his leadership in diversity building among the academic sector of the university. And certainly he and his cadre of faculty for composing this event this morning during Black History Month to address the economic status of African Americans in the 21st century. I'm looking forward to hearing Dr. George Wright in conversation with Dr. Biswas, who is one of our distinguished professors in the College of Business as well, certainly. We are honored to have Dr. George Wright with us today. I see and I've read his credentials and have studied him a little bit and see that he is among the best of our nation's thought leaders in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion. There are books and books and books and chapters all about this great work that originated at the beginning of time, and certainly in this country at 1619, if not sooner. I have come to realize that we have an insufficient supply, in my opinion, of diversity leaders in our academies who are seasoned, who have a depth of knowledge, who have personal experiences, and have studied the science of these trodden pathways over time. Dr. Wright, for the past 10 years or so, I want to share with you that I have enjoyed, as one of Marshall's leaders, a relationship with the University of Kentucky and your president down there. Mm-hmm. I see him occasionally. I've been to his house for lunch, and But our work there is relevant to a National Science Foundation grant. I think we're in our 11th or 12th year for the Lewis Stokes Initiative. And I am the PI representing Marshall. And University of Kentucky is the central universities among, I think we have 8 or 9 universities, University of Kentucky, Marshall and Louisville and Western Union University, Western Kentucky and others. And you're doing great work there, and I have been actively involved in that, and University of Kentucky has done great work in leading that NSF work, and Marshall is recognized as one of the leaders. For those who are listening, this is an NSF program to supporting undergraduate minority students who are in the STEM students for academic success as well as undergraduate research. But before Dr. Wright and Dr. Biswas are introduced by our dean, I want to comment a few minutes on diversity, equity, and inclusion work here at Marshall. I came to Marshall in 1966 as a freshman, as one of 35 Black students on campus at that time. It looks like I'm a couple of 3 years older than Dr. Wright, if I've judged this correctly. This was during the heated and celebrated days of civil rights, the Black Power movement, Malcolm X, the early days of integrating white colleges and universities, the Vietnam War, the hippie movement, the freedom movement. And I look back and I see that we have not had enough strong and sustained diversity minority leaders, diversity movement leaders. But the few that have been here have created a great pathway that makes it a much more stronger foundation for us that are here today, and particularly faculty and our students. Some of those names that I know well over these years is people like Professor Carter and Colonel Billups, who hardly anyone knows about him. Dr. Betty Jane Cleckley, who deceased just a couple of weeks ago, and Dr. Sherry Smith and Ken Blue, for example. This work requires a sustained vision, leadership, and passion, and grit, because you can't give up. The struggle is hard. Sometimes people want you to give up. Dr. Gilbert, our president, is among the great leaders. He's a Mississippi guy. He came here and grew up in Jim Crow in Mississippi. He has told me about his growing up experiences in his school and his family and his church. He has been soundly and genuinely and deeply affected by that. And consequently, we are in good hands, because most communities, and certainly universities, if you're going to do really good work in this arena, there needs to be a thought leader. And Dr. Jerome Gilbert is, I'm not just saying this to be a nice guy. I'm saying this because it is serious, because in fact, he is at Marshall University. So several years ago, I will share some of the things. Several years ago, Dr. Gilbert created what is now called the President's Commission on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And that is led by some administrators and several faculty members throughout the year. And this group plans and conducts various initiatives, programs, and speaking engagements and discussion and debate groups and throughout the year. And it certainly has elevated our focus on this work throughout the commission. During the past year, through the president's work, the university has implemented bias training for employees, and has also stressed the importance to search committees, particularly faculty search committees, to be more intentional in developing diverse candidate pools. We in fact are now working, and just in recent weeks and this week, are working on some very specific, stronger initiatives that hopefully will lead to the employment of a significant greater number of minority and women faculty, but also strengthening our work in increasing minority student enrollment, which is now at about 14%. Also would like to recognize, I won't go into detail about the undertakings of the Carter G. Woodson Lyceum that was created probably 5 or 6 years ago. And we're also doing great work at the School of Medicine and lowering the guards on permitting minority students based on MCAT scores. And I think we are moving in the right direction on that. And I'm looking forward to some promising decisions on that in the next year. We'll also have some very progressive initiatives between Marshall and the School of Medicine that will in fact substantially increase the number of minority students who will enroll in our medical school starting in 2022. The University of Marshall now is working on I forget whether it's a 3 or 4 year study with the Higher Learning Commission. And our work now that we're in the final stages of submitting a proposal is going to be on the avenue of diversity, equity, and inclusive initiatives at the university. These will be new progressive initiatives that will be studied, evaluated, and measured. And you have to report on it, so it just cannot be speculative kind of work. We will have the development of a new intercultural center at Marshall University that will open this fall. And there's been great work that has gone in the development of that. It will be in a showcase environment on campus over in East Hall. And I look forward that in the next 2 to 3 years that the work and the socialization and integration of students and faculty from that center will be transformative. I will comment on the work of the Society of Black Scholars and our support of the Marshall University Black Alumni, and the tremendous work that comes out of the Office for the Center for African American Students and the LGBT programs. And in general, I have noticed, as a guardian of the work that we're doing, that the mindset of many administrative people and faculty at Marshall University in the last 3 to 4 years is beginning to change noticeably. People are becoming more outspoken and sharing their views about race and equity and the difficulty that we go through. Dr. Gilbert last summer assembled a new group called the Coalition for Anti-Racism, and that's made up of some university leaders as well as leaders from the community, and great work is coming out of that coalition as well. All of these actions, including this discussion today, are helping Marshall on this journey towards equity and equality. I am delighted that Dr. Wright is with us today. I wish I could shake his hand and sit down and have lunch with him after he speaks with us. But we know that these days we cannot. I will ask our dean of the business school that perhaps in the future, when we're able to let our guards down, that Dr. Wright will travel over to this campus and we'll go to a nice place where we can see each other and embrace each other and have deeper thought and discussion about this. And at this time, I will turn this back over to our dean of the College of Business, and I look forward to enjoying the rest of the morning with everyone else. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Cooley. Your passion and your leadership of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts at Marshall are truly exemplary, and we are so grateful for that. I'm proud to introduce now our today's featured speaker, Dr. George C. Wright. Dr. Wright is currently serving as a senior advisor to the president, interim vice president for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and a distinguished research professor at the University of Kentucky. Prior to this, Dr. Wright has served as the president of Prairie View A&M University from 2003 to 2017, that's a 14-year term, and as executive vice president for academic affairs and provost at the University of Texas at Arlington from 1996 to 2003. In 1993, Dr. Wright joined the faculty at Duke University as Vice Provost for Undergraduate Programs, Director of the African American Studies, and held the William R. Kinnan Jr. Chair in American History. George Wright received his bachelor's degree in history from the University of Kentucky in 1972, his master's degree in history from the University of Kentucky in 1974, and his PhD in history from Duke University in 1977. Dr. Wright's teaching experience began as an assistant professor of history at the University of Kentucky. In 1980, he started teaching at the University of Texas at Austin, where he eventually became a full professor and the holder of the Mastin Gentry White Professorship of Southern History. For 12 consecutive years at the University of Texas, Dr. Wright was voted one of the 10 best faculty on the annual list of 10 best and 10 worst faculty of the entire 3,000 faculty at the university. He received the Jean Holloway Award for Teaching Excellence in the Colleges of Science and Arts and the Top Teaching Award for the entire university, the Lillian and Tom B. Rhodes Centennial Teaching Fellow, which carried a $10,000 prize. Dr. Wright has received a number of awards from the University of Kentucky, including Honorary Doctorate of Letters and induction in the Hall of Distinguished Alumni. Dr. Wright has authored 3 books on race relations. For his scholarly activities, he received the University of Kentucky Libraries Award for Intellectual Achievement in 2015. Dr. Wright is not only a renowned scholar and a successful academic leader, but also a committed mentor to many academics and administrators. I am fortunate to have him as my coach since 2019, when I attended the Millennium Leadership Institute program offered by the American Association of State Colleges and Universities, ASCU for short. Thank you, Dr. Wright, for joining us today.
Thank you.
I will also now introduce Dr. Nabanita Biswas, who will facilitate this session in conversation with Dr. Wright. Dr. Biswas came to the Lewis College of Business as a tenure-track assistant professor of economics in 2017, the same year I joined Marshall University, after receiving her PhD degree in economics from the University of Georgia. Nabanita's primary research fields are applied microeconomics, applied econometrics, development economics, and health economics. She is highly passionate about inclusive economic growth as she explores the linkages between economic development and social inclusion. Dr. Biswas will set the stage for some intriguing questions, and Dr. Wright will provide his perspectives on the historical evolution of economic progress of African Americans through various periods in our US history. After the discussion, Dr. Wright will answer some questions from the audience, which will be managed by our Associate Dean for Accreditation and Strategic Initiatives, Dr. Nancy Langton. I will now turn over the program to Dr. Nabanita Biswas.
Thank you, Dean Mukherjee, for that introduction, and Dr. Cooley for all the updates on the recent initiatives aimed at social inclusion at Marshall University and beyond. And indeed, it is a pleasure to have Dr. Wright with us today for this webinar, and I'm really looking forward to hearing his thoughts on our topic today, which is very pertinent given that many societies across the world are grappling with discrimination based on human identities more generally, and it hinders socioeconomic progress in those nations. This recent Black Lives Matter movement has actually brought to the forefront the issues of racial inequality and social injustice. And it also brings cognizance to the broader dimensions of racial inequality, such as those related to social status or economic freedom. Now, differences in economic outcomes have persisted by race have persisted in the United States for centuries, and they continue up to the present day. Particularly on the economic status of African Americans, the recent census data from 2017 actually shows that the median household income of African Americans is $20,000 to $25,000 less than that of white Americans. And naturally, regions with a higher share of Black populations experience higher levels of economic distress or exhibit higher levels of poverty. What is more alarming is the fact that these differences, the racial disparities, persist through generations and systematically inhibit the ability of certain population subgroups from realizing their full economic potential. And in a multiracial society, such as that in the United States, any systemic racism that prevents certain population subgroups from realizing their full economic potential over generations carries significant economic costs. In fact, recent research shows that this wealth gap between American whites and American Blacks is estimated to cost the US economy somewhere between $1 to $1.5 trillion between 2019 and 2028. And therefore, policies targeting sustainable long-term economic growth need to address these existing racial gaps in areas like employment, education, and healthcare. And in order to do so successfully, it is important to understand the factors and the sources of these racial disparities, or the factors that have led to or have shaped the geographic and economic mobility of African Americans. And therefore, in fact, these factors have been studied heavily and they're debated, with explanations ranging from slavery to residential segregation and discrimination to parental income and wealth, as well as family structures. But what is the common theme across these studies is the fact that it's the evolution of events, policies, legislation that have impacted the society in ways to create these racial gaps over time. And therefore, since we have the pleasure of having a renowned historian amidst us, this is the perfect opportunity to take a walk back in time and understand and identify those factors that is partially or responsible for the current socioeconomic status of African Americans. So Dr. Wright, with that, I would like for you to take us through time and let's go back to the origins of the racial discrimination, the African diaspora that was probably sparked off by the interests of colonial rulers, the economic motivations of colonial rulers. And I'm sorry, you're muted.
Let's see.
Yes. I think we can hear you now.
Oh, okay.
And so basically we'd like to understand that what are the key factors that led to the large scale displacement of these African natives, and how did it shape their economic outcomes in the settlements of these natives in the West and in America in the period leading up to the Civil War?
Okay. First of all, it is indeed a privilege to have this opportunity to be at Marshall University today. Growing up in Kentucky, there were occasions that took me to Huntington, West Virginia. There was an amusement park there and things like that. So I can remember going to West Virginia. So I'm very honored to have this opportunity today, even though it's on Zoom. Any issues that we're grappling with today probably have some, not in every instance, but there's probably some connection to the past. And one can then argue how far back and the like. But when you talk about economic disparity, there are clearly things that happen in the past that have impacted the future, the present. And an example, in August 2019 was the 400th anniversary of when the first slaves arrived in colonial Virginia. And as you know, at that time, up until the end to the middle of the Civil War, actually, West Virginia was part of the first the colony and then the state of Virginia. At any rate, a lot of people talked about the 400th anniversary of slavery. What they should have said in British North America, because it's clear that slavery in the Americas predated that. You said in your introductory remarks to this whole topic, you said the African diaspora. We could talk all day about how the people from Africa went to all of the places in what we call, quote, the New World, but they also would go in slavery to India, to China, to what we call the Orient as well. But also, it's important to understand, though, if we just focus on North America, and even if we just focus on British North America, it's important to at least say that whatever number we use of the number of people who left Africa and came to the Americas, whatever the number, we will probably underestimate. It could be 15 million, it could be 60 million. But even that number does not count the number of people who were in villages, in communities, and so forth, and who were part of the long trek to the sea. And also, it's important to remember that most of the people did not come to British North America. Some 45% of them went to the Portuguese-held territory of Brazil, or somewhere around 10%, maybe even less, came to what we now call the United States. But it clearly has an economic tie wherever we talk about slavery, even though it became very early on to put slavery and race together, because in the New World, it was clear that slavery was African people. It had an economic motive, that Europeans, starting with the Spanish, starting with the Portuguese, explored Africa in the 1500s. They were interested in trade. They were interested in routes to go to the east and so forth. And of course, they were interested in gold, just like they were interested in gold in the New World. And scholars then say they found yet another gold, black gold, so to speak, human gold. And so if you look at first Portugal, and then Spain, they then start settling, start colonizing in places in what we call the Caribbean, the West Indies, and then even North America. It would be the English, though, from where we're situated, that would be the ones. And the British had a very important reason that they saw the economic value. I'll make this point very quickly. In 2018, my wife and I were in London specifically to see an exhibit at the London Dock, D-O-C-K Museum. It's a maritime museum. It was called London Sugar and Slavery. And it had this huge exhibit on how much the sugar enterprise, from plantations to all the production of that, fueled London, fueled England, fueled the Industrial Revolution. And toward the end, it said, in the British colonies of North America, especially in the New England colonies, they began to duplicate everything that the merchants were doing in London, in Manchester, in France, that they become involved in a triangular trade where they would go from all places in North America to the west coast of Africa, to places in the Caribbean, and then back to Boston and other places. And all of those areas, they were successful financially. And the other aspect was that it's during the colonial period where slavery becomes a national institution. It's not just a Southern institution, it is a national institution, because the wealth of the Northern colonies comes from there. Brown University is one of the schools that has documented how much it benefited from the slave trade. So clearly, the economics of slavery would fuel, as that exhibit said in London, the Industrial Revolution, making England and then the new United States powers based on the revenues that they generated. First, the slave trade, which stops in 1807, 1808, but England and British and the North American area had benefited greatly from the slave trade and from rice and sugar production.
Exactly. And what is interesting is that you observe this phenomena across other parts of the world in the colonial period. You see how the economic growth and the economic advancement of certain subgroups of the population is based on the exploitation and the marginalization of other subgroups of population. And history has shown that again and again. British rulers in China, in India, and even today we observe that. For example, is the Gap factories in Bangladesh that produce, that have no fire safety protocols, that don't follow that because it's cheap labor. So this sort of hegemony, it has persisted through time, and it just changes form from one era to the next. And so what actually happened after the colonial era? How would you describe the changes in the economic status?
Well, let me tie it, though, to the whole movement for freedom in the New World, led by the British colonies. As we know, revolution occurs in 1776, and they say they want their freedom. They wanted to end their enslavement from England. Well, there were people who saw the contradiction of saying, we want to be free while enslaving others, but there's no question about it. It made these British colonies, who become the United States, grapple with this issue. And here's what I think is so important, that in what becomes the United States, you can call it a contradiction, you can call it a dilemma, but freedom and slavery progress together. The country that is first in freedom is also first in in slavery. And what it means that, let's say by the early 1800s, slavery is less of a factor in the northern colonies, or now the northern states, but it is in the South, period 1800 to 1860, where cotton becomes king. Rice had always been a predominant thing. And so slavery takes on a very important aspect of the Southern economy during that time. And so if you go forward during the rest of the slavery period in the United States, you see how the North becomes more industrialized, i.e., it has used slavery as a pillar or one of its foundations, but it moves in other ways, where the South is still tied to a more agrarian economy based on slavery, even though most Southerners do not own slaves. By 1860, to jump ahead, there are 8 million whites in the South. Only 4 million of the 8 million are tied to slavery in some way or the other. But nevertheless, slavery dominates the Southern economy. The Civil War ends. Okay, the Civil War ends. Two very fascinating things. On the one, what do you do with the ex-slaves? What are they given? They are, in fact, free, but they're not given any economic, if you use word stimulus, whatever word you choose to use, they receive nothing along with their freedom. Now, one should not necessarily have sympathy for the Southern slave owners, but they do lose a commodity, i.e. these human beings. And I'm not saying this from I'm just trying to talk about this in economic terms. I'm not, we know slavery was wrong, so I'm not talking about it in that term, but the South loses a great economic asset with slavery coming to an end, but they immediately shift with Northern consent. What do we do with the Negro? That's essentially what they said. That's what's the lane. What do we do with the Negro? And you then see an economic process put in place in the South that discriminates against the ex-slaves. For instance, the convict labor system, of where numerous Southern businesses would thrive, often over the backs of people who had been arrested on trumped up charges, would exist down to the New Deal period in much of the South. And so Black economic labor becomes an important aspect of the South Once slavery had ended, just like it had been earlier. So it's a continuation. Some people said slavery by another name. I think it's very telling that Martin Luther King, in his famous speech in 1963, said it's 100 years after slavery, but we're only now throwing the shackles off. He was talking about economically, he was talking about politically, he was talking about in the unfairness of the system.
Absolutely right. And that's exactly what I was thinking about, because I think at some point, for when this kind of exploitation or marginalization continues for years, and it's driven by pure economic interests maybe, or motivations for economic gains, but then it leads the society to a point where this becomes part of the culture, where not only the perpetrators of the marginalization, but also the victims of the marginalization begin to accept it as being the norm, right? And this is exactly what we have observed in other economies as well, that once the colonial rulers left, it was their own people, the natives of that place, who tried to continue that tradition that the colonial rulers left behind. And so I'm going back to Dr. Martin Luther King's address in 1963, where he actually brought up this point that, African Americans still can, even 100 years after the abolition of slavery, African Americans still enjoyed an inferior socioeconomic status relative to the rest of the society. So clearly they did not receive the appropriate economic stimulus that would have helped them come up at par with the rest of the society. But what, if any, reforms that did happen during this period, and why did it not help bridge the gap?
Okay, let me share this with you. One of the things I say to my students, over the years, I've taught 2 African-American history classes, the basic, almost everyone, I'm sure at Marshall University and so forth, teach a general survey of Afro-American history using 1865 as the cutoff, and then 1865 to the present. Well, in addition to that, over the years, I've developed some seminars where I talk about it in a more global sense, slavery in the Americas, and then the freedom struggle throughout the world. All right. If you follow me, you're going to say George Wright contradicts himself. All of the things you and I just said, I say, but then let me add this as well. 1865, Black people are freed with only the clothes on their back. Okay, but guess what they start doing in 1865? They start creating Black communities. Many of them, in places all over America, put their little monies, and how do slave or ex-slaves have any money, but they started churches. Within those churches, they started the rudiments of elementary schools. But guess what else? They realized that you need some kind of something that we might call insurance. So they started burial societies, or societies that, with the cold weather that we've experienced, might give people $1 or something like that. People worked and acquired farmland and things like this. During the very same people, when the South created the Black codes to relegate Black people to work in certain kinds of jobs, you also see Black farm ownership increasing. In 1900, to jump ahead, there was a World's Fair in Paris, France. Okay, 2 years before the World's Fair, 2 Black leaders who ideologically were opposed to each other, Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass, decided in 1898, I don't know whose idea it was, but they petitioned the United States Congress for $25,000 for a Negro exhibit at the 1900 World's Fair in Paris. The Congress gives that, and so Black people had asked for a separate exhibit, and this exhibit takes place, and its theme is the progress of the American Negro since slavery. And by progress, they showed the number of Black-owned businesses, Black farms, Blacks involved in all sorts of things. So here is another theme. All the way down from the end of slavery to 2021, you see Blacks not quite being fully integrated into the mainstream of American society economically, yet you do see successful Black people as well. And any number of those businesses were women-owned businesses. So I share this to just show you that it's both are happening. Now clearly, I don't want to put too fine a light on Black success economically, but Black people did the impossible from 1865 forward. They uplifted themselves. I love to tell people, have you ever tried to uplift yourself? All of us right now are sitting in a chair. We cannot uplift ourselves. Somebody else can uplift us. Someone can help us. So I mentioned that. So Martin Luther King and all of those folk by 1963, while they're correct in saying the mass of Black people have been left behind, there are Black people who somehow have been able to prosper. I was president of a historically Black college. If I hadn't gone there, even though I had studied Black history all these years, and I don't think I would have known this. I'm first generation in my family, my wife's first generation, their family, I know all that. At a school like Prairie View, I met folk who were fifth generation. Do you hear me? That in other words, there are folk who went to college in the 1860s, 1880s, 1910s, and so on down the line. So it's both in America. Black people who somehow have made it, the vast majority of Black people who are not at the mainstream, that are in this discriminatory situation.
And that is so true. And you see that not just among African Americans or a particular race, but even for women. You brought up that point, and that's very relevant. In fact, I was going to also mention about this recent paper that was published in a very reputed economic journal, which talked about patent racism at the turn of the 20th century, which basically kind of prevented Black inventors and investors from commercializing their patents, their products, and that was a huge economic loss for the nation. So that was a very interesting paper, and it brought up the Wall Street of Black people, the Tulsa, So anyway, I mean, I don't want to divert a lot, but here's what I wanted to ask you. You did say that a lot of women were on the forefront. They advanced in the Black community. But right now we do see an occupational segregation of Black women. So what is it about the evolution of these events and policies? Did it affect men and women within the Black community differently? How did it shape their economic outcomes differently than men?
Okay, go back to the end of slavery. The 13th Amendment ends slavery. The 14th Amendment gives citizenship rights. The 15th Amendment gives the ultimate right of a democracy, the right to vote, but it was for men only. You see, that ironically, the push, Blacks are so discriminated as a group, but the push initially is to make sure that Black men have the same rights or on an equal status or stature with other men. And this often meant that women were relegated. If you go back during slavery, there always were examples of enterprising African-American women and so on down the line. Well, that continues, but clearly discrimination of women lags at every point. I'm gonna jump to the present because I think it's my lifetime. This is a George Wright observation, okay? So you have to take, and I know I'm dealing with folk in economics and you're gonna ask me about where are my statistics and all of this other stuff, and I'm okay with that. Okay, I have been affiliated with the University of Kentucky, love the University of Kentucky, okay? Duke University gave me, I love Duke University, love the University of Texas at Austin. Really appreciate the University of Texas at Arlington that made me a provost and so forth, and Prairie View. But here's a comment. At all the predominantly white schools that I have been affiliated with, they were perhaps further behind on gender than they were on race. But race was something that was so obvious that they could not deny the absence of Black people, but they could rationalize away the absence of women in general. And so I have seen, and again, my unofficial thing, everywhere I've ever been, I've seen the discrimination of Black women, the discrimination of all women, regardless of their race, regardless of whether international or not. And so the push has been, I would argue, that people like me who understand the discrimination that we face, that we've got to really challenge for women. And if you look, I can't speak to Marshall University, all those universities I mentioned, today, they have more than 50% of their student body is female, topped by places like Prairie View and HBCU, where 70% of the students are female. You don't think they need more women of all colors at these institutions, but women are denied. Most of us grew up being told there are things that women can't do. But as I go back through history, anytime there was a shortage of men, guess what? Women could do it. In fact, I love hearing people say there's a shortage of manpower. I always then say, well, guess what? They have it made, because it means they haven't tapped woman power or human power. They just tap men power. But seriously, the discrimination of women is often more insidious and more difficult to overturn than has been the overall discrimination of race. And so it really comes home in the presence of Black and women.
Absolutely. And the sad part is that in many societies, women themselves actually self-select into discrimination because they believe that is the norm. So it's women's agency that now actually perpetuates the discrimination amongst their own kind. And so, yes, they are underrepresented in policy, and not just in the United States, everywhere in the world. And yes, women make up half the population in the world. However, they do not enjoy equal status as men in many.
You know what I think is a real challenge for anybody is that maybe there are certain things that people say so much that you almost all become immune to it. Like you'll hear someone say it's important to have someone who, quote, looks like me in those positions. Well, it is important to have someone who looks like you. It's something about that sure, I should be able to relate to anybody. I should be able to get a role model from anybody. And I understand I can do that. But when you're 16 years old, if you only see men do certain things and you only see women do certain things, it's very easy to have a connotation. This is women's work. This is men's work. This is men's things and so forth. You know, when I was growing up playing sports, now think about this, you're playing sports. Anytime you messed up, they put a label of a female on you. They called you a female term. Now, what does making an error, missing a free throw, dropping the ball, how does that make you a female? You just athletically are not very good. It doesn't make you that. But after a while, I said to her, I'm not ashamed. If you want to call me a girl, what's the negative about that? I've got a mama, sister, eventually a wife, but it's a mindset. And so people believe, so I know Black people who believe they can't do certain things. I've met women who have had it so ingrained that they can't do it. And so the wonder is, how do we get people to overcome those barriers?
Exactly. And you're absolutely right. This takes me back to one of the comments you made, that the impetus has to come from the society. It cannot be just the marginalized or those who intentionally or unintentionally ended up marginalizing some subsections of the population or society.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know what I decided for this year for Black History Month? And I think it's in light of what's happened, the George Floyd murder, the Breonna Taylor incident and so forth, is that I wanted to focus on saying to folk, I want you to remember that in every phase of African-American history, there have been whites who were committed. That is not just Black people demanding changes, but it's people from the majority group or people who enjoy certain rights who have to demand, who have to stand beside. Just like I would argue that I, as a man, must stand beside and be a champion for any group of people that I'm not a member of who are being challenged. So economically, it's got to take the larger group. I was so pleased to hear your colleague mention the things that Marshall University is doing. It takes Marshall doing those things. It takes the University of Kentucky. It takes all of those schools. It takes predominantly white schools that say, no, we have got to make these things our commitment as well.
Absolutely right. And that brings me, I think we're very close to time, and I can see some questions from the audience that I think
Sure.
Dr. Langton will take over from me. But I just wanted to point out that we as a society, regardless of race, regardless of any human identity for that matter, need to come together, be mindful and aware of the differences that exist, which nobody intentionally perpetrates. But even like economic motivations could lead to those outcomes, those differences in outcomes, the racial gaps, gender gaps. And as a society, we ought to be mindful of these so that we can actually rectify them and progress both economically and socially. And I think that change has to come from within all of us. It's not just about certain segments of the population. And again, going back to the marginalization of any subgroup of the population, that's, again, it's not intentional, but inadvertently, it might so happen that these the marginalized have a common racial or gender identity. And the idea is that we as a society can improve on it, can fix that so that we can progress as a nation.
Yeah.
So
I realize there are people who have questions. I'll make my last point based on this. I've been very fortunate, as just like the gentleman who spoke before me. I started college in 1968 because after the death of Martin Luther King, the University of Kentucky was committed to bringing about changes, and they came up with a special summer program. Well, that special summer program allowed me, a person who'd been an average high school student, to be admitted to UK. And 9 years later, I had a PhD from Duke. And I'm now, if you do the math, if I started in 68, just do the math, it makes me like 70 years old. Well, I had all of these opportunities that came my way. Did I get them because I was smart? Did I work harder than other people? No, I was given a unique opportunity. So I've got to make sure that other people have an opportunity. I'm at Marshall University, and so I don't want to cause any trouble there today, but I like to tell folks my favorite scripture from the Bible. So if it's going to get me in trouble, I'll take it. John, the 4th chapter, 37-38 says, "'Tis true that some sow and others reap. I sent you to reap where you did not sow. Others did the work and you received the harvest." What does that mean? George Wright was given an opportunity because white people, Black people, international people demanded that changes come about. I walked through a door that I had nothing to do with open. I now have got to open doors for other people as well. So I'll stop there and entertain any questions.
absolutely, it was an absolute pleasure. This conversation was so engaging, and I'm glad you basically shed some light on the factors that led us to this point, because this is the way we can progress and bring about meaningful change in the society. With that, I would leave everyone in the hands of Dr. Langton. I think she will bring up the audience questions for us.
Thank you, Navanita. And thank you, Dr. Wright, it was a lively discussion, and we all learned a lot about history and economics and great topics for Black History Month. There's a question in the chat function, and let me read the first one. What is the impact of Black universities on diversity, inclusion, and equity in the U.S.?
Okay, all right. I think Black universities have done an excellent job for as long as they've existed in creating leaders, in creating opportunities for Blacks to be in positions that are often not the case at other places, and they then can take those talents elsewhere. And what I think is important, I've seen any number of predominantly white schools then work with these schools. Morehouse and Spelman have always had pipelines into some of the Ivy League schools. Howard University has done that. When I was president of Prairie View A&M University, University of Kentucky, and I worked out relationships that I think we both benefit from that. But Black schools, I think, instill a certain quality in their students that I think is invaluable for them to take to the larger society. I am so pleased that our vice president today is a product of an HBCU. And I think that's going to open the door for even more people like her in positions all over this country.
Thank you. Another question we have from the audience is, can you briefly address how the COVID-19 pandemic has worsened the status of African Americans?
Yeah. Again, I think we all are aware of the fact that that African Americans, and if we had had time, I would have talked about African Americans and health going back to slavery and how there are certain conditions among African Americans that started during slavery that have remained issue. Let's say even if COVID was not an issue, if we said we're going to talk about diabetes, then we would say harder on African Americans. We're going to talk about heart disease. If we were going to talk about most cancers, we would say African Americans, and we would also say Latinx folk. Then throw in COVID, and then throw in that we now know very clearly, depending on where you live in Lexington, Kentucky, or I won't say Huntington since I don't live there, but in many places across the country, it's greater access to folk who are not of these groups. For instance, the University of Kentucky, I'm very proud to say, is making it easier because we're taking mobile units to Black churches and Black communities and not have people have to register online and things like that. So clearly, the health disparities that have always existed are accentuated even greater with COVID. On the one hand, you could say COVID has not discriminated, that there are people of every sector of American society who have tragically contracted and died. But clearly in the curing of it, we come back to the racial and socioeconomic conditions playing a factor.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Dr. Wright, how important is the role of apprenticeships and internships in connecting African American students to career opportunities? Okay. Are you seeing more universities actively getting involved in these types of internships?
Okay. When I was president of a Black school, that was so essential for students to develop relationships, let's say with research universities like Texas A&M, University of Texas, and a lot of other places for students to do that, to learn, to see what it's like to be in those things. Also, when I was in Texas, it was important for students to have opportunities to work at oil companies and things like that. Now at the University of Kentucky, they have something called the Mentor Leadership Training, where UK students work with Fortune 500 companies. This starts during their sophomore year. And by the time they graduate, there are job opportunities available. Well, guess what? The University of Kentucky has been doing this for 8 students a year. Our president said, we're going to do this for 200 folks. Do you see that leap 8 to 200. I didn't say 8 to 10 to 20, 8 to 200 because of the value it is. It's a two-way street. Students learn about companies or learn about universities. They learn about them as well. I will say, even though you might not think about myself as being in a mentorship program, but one does not become a college administrator. Heck, one does not even become successful as a college professor without being mentored at every stage. And so I had mentors when I was a professor. I most definitely had people who told me all about the track of becoming an administrator. And so having people who can give you advice, who can help you in those, they can't make you. You ultimately still have to make your own decision. But I think that's so important. I wouldn't be here were it not for a long list of mentors.
Thank you very much. My clock decided it was time to ring. Sorry
Right.
about that.
No problem.
This was a wonderful presentation, Dr. Wright and Dr. Biswas. We really appreciate it. I'm going to turn it over to Dean Avi Mukherjee to conclude the event today.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wright, for this truly inspiring, lively, engaging, and insightful discussion. I think we learned a lot, we enjoyed a lot, and this passion and inspiration will remain in our community for long and will truly inspire us to do better. This wraps it up for our 13th Third Insights webinar. We want to announce our signature event, the Spring 2021 CEO panel that is coming up on March 3rd, Wednesday, moderated by Brad D. Smith and featuring Chris Gardner, author of The Pursuit of Happiness, the Hollywood movie, and Shelley Archambault, who was the first African-American woman to be CEO of a Silicon Valley tech company. As you can see, our CEO panel will also have a diversity focus for our March event. Look forward for your registration emails to arrive shortly. Please share the email invite with anyone you know who might benefit from these events. We truly appreciate your participation. Stay safe as we come out of this worst winter storm that we have seen here in a long time. And always remember, we are Marshall.
Sounds good. All right.